In this lecture, we're going to talk about some typesetting and page layout rules. Now, a lot of these particular rules come from the Robert Bringhurst book, The Elements of Typographic Style, which I did introduce in an earlier lecture. And the purpose of this particular lecture is to start to get you to think about things in terms of being a layout artist. Instead of just somebody with a computer who can just copy and paste text or just be able to kind of make a page look pretty, we are considered artists. As a layout artist, there are rules and guidelines, just like any other art form. Just like with painting or even music, there are specific guidelines that we need to follow. And in this case, in this lecture, we're going to go over a lot of these typesetting rules for two purposes. One, you need to understand why these rules exist, but also number two, you need to know them so that in case you later on down the line you come across a particular project, you know which rules you may need to break. So to get started, let's talk about some of the first principles in typesetting. The first principle is typography exists to honor the content. So in this particular case, think of it like this, and this is one of the quotes here out of Robert Bringhurst. He says, like oratory, music, dance, and calligraphy, anything that lends itself to grace or language, typography is an art that can be deliberately misused. It's a craft by which the meanings of the text, or the absence of meaning, can be clarified, honored, and shared, or knowingly disguised. If you think about this, of all the times you've ever seen text, written text, printed text, there's a meaning behind the words. Whether you are reading a non-fictional novel, whether you're reading a textbook, whether you're watching TV and text flashes across the screen, maybe for informational purposes, or maybe you're watching an ad and they're trying to get you to buy something, text will exist for a reason. And this content can be either completely and totally skewed or raised up and honored by the typographer's choices. So the typefaces that you choose, how it's actually laid out, the size, the style, all of these things lend themselves to having either a good bit of text, something that is legible, something that the reader has a chance of being able to digest in an easy fashion, or maybe it absolutely just obscures everything. It makes it to where these messages lose their meaning altogether because the type essentially pulls away the reader's attention. Or some of the things we've talked about previously when it comes to measure length, for instance. If you don't have a proper measure length, you may end up finding yourself rereading the page over the same line over and over and over again. So typography should exist to honor the content. And you want to make sure that the typeface and how you lay out the type goes towards and helps to uplift the content for the reader. The second principle is that letters have a life of their own. And if we look at type, or we look at the written word, the smallest unit, the smallest piece or bit of any written piece is going to be a single letter form. These letters themselves are in some cases works of art. If you take a look at how much time and trouble and effort goes into actually creating individual typefaces, the painstaking work to get the proper curvature or the bowl of a specific letter form, a lot of these letter forms are works of art in and of themselves, and you can treat them as such. So when you're working in layout and you're working in typesetting, one of the things you need to think about is not just obviously how this type is going to relate to a user, but the individual bits and pieces that make up these words. How are they put together? When we're talking about this digitally in layout, we're talking about things like kerning or tracking. How close are these letter forms together? The proximity from one shape to another shape. Does that make it easier to read? Does it make it harder to read? Does it interrupt the flow? In other words, if you're kerning, if your space between the letters is off, let's say you have too big of a gap between letters, sometimes as you're starting to read, that little bit of extra space kind of becomes a subconscious little speed bump for the reader and can, just as you running over a speed bump at a high speed in your car, can kind of jar you and take you out of the experience that you have of reading the actual text. So you have to really think about how the letters actually flow in the letters themselves. The third principle is that there is a style beyond style. And I know this kind of sounds like it's, it's a little bit of an oddball statement, right? There is style beyond style. It's like a fortune cookie saying. But in this particular case, what this means is that typographic style, in a large, intelligent sense of the word, does not mean a particular style, like my style or your style or neoclassical or Baroque style. But it's the power to move freely through the whole domain of typography and to function at every step in a way that is graceful and vital. It means typography can walk familiar ground without sliding into platitudes, typography that responds to new conditions with innovative solutions, and typography that does not confuse the reader with its own originality. One of my favorite metaphors when it comes to typographic style is this, is that you need to think about typography is to literature like a musical performance is to a composition. And it's an essential act of basically interpretation. It's full of a lot of different opportunities or insights. And this in and of itself makes sense. If you think about from the standpoint of your favorite musician, one of your favorite pieces, you know full well that if you're listening to that song by that artist versus going down at, say, a karaoke bar and listening to somebody screech it out, the performance of that music, the music didn't change, right? The composition didn't change. It's the performance that changed. And the performer itself can either lend beauty and grace and honor to a particular piece, or can essentially cause you to run out of that place screaming like your hair's on fire because, they're tone deaf. Just watch a season of American Idol if you don't know what I'm talking about. But in and of itself, the style that we have as far as typography goes, we have the ability in the way that we lay out text, just like a performer does with music, you can actually manipulate behavior and emotions. Propagandists throughout the 20th century understood this, especially the early 20th century. If you go back and look at some of the earlier works of some of the communist bloc nations or even the fascist countries such as early 30s Germany, even Woodrow Wilson's administration here in America, going back into the earlier part of the 1900s, propagandists understood that it wasn't just what you said, it was how it was being said, or in this particular case, how it was being laid out, how it was being presented. So there is a style beyond style, and in and of itself, typography is like a performance of the written word, and we have to think about it in those particular cases. So let's talk about some of the tactics when it comes to laying out text. The first one is, and this is pretty important, if you've got the time, you need to read the text before you design it. You need to understand what is the author trying to convey, because it is up to you to ensure that however you are laying out the type, that the author's meaning comes through in the text. Again, there's a lot of times when we're reading books or we're reading manuals or anything that you're talking about, and you'll find yourself dozing off or drifting. And it may not be because the text or the plot or the script or the characters that the author is describing or the actual story itself is bad, but it's just because the type itself, the typesetting, the layout, just did not allow that message to kind of come through to the reader. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we read the text. We need to understand the text before we actually design it. The next tactic is that you need to kind of take it upon yourself to discover what we call the outer logic of the typography within the inner logic of the text. So in this particular case, I'm going to read here from Bringhurst's book. He says that a novel often purports to be a seamless river of words from the beginning to the end of the book, or it's a series of unnamed scenes. Whereas research papers, textbooks, cookbooks, and other works of nonfiction are rarely as smooth. They're often layered with chapter heads or section heads, subheads, block quotes, footnotes, endnotes, lists, illustrations, and a lot of these features can obscure the writing, even if they're clear in the author's mind. But for the sake of the reader, each of these elements requires its own typographic identity and form. Every layer and level of the text must be consistent, distinct, and yet harmonious in form. A lot of times you can think about this in terms of, say, an orchestra. You have many different instruments that need to come together to perform as one. The music that they need to perform needs to come together in a way that it makes sense. You don't want to have, a bunch of violins playing, one set of notes and a trumpet playing a note that just sounds just as terrible, and the drummer back there is playing like Animal from the Muppets, and it's just mass chaos. The same thing goes with your topography, with your layout. You want to make sure, and a lot of times we talk about this in simpler terms in the basics class when we discuss that you want to try to keep it to about 3 typefaces for any particular piece that you're designing. The more typefaces you introduce, the more quote-unquote instruments, so to speak, that you're introducing to the musical performance. The problem with that is that you have a chance, or you will actually come up against issues where a lot of different typefaces are not harmonious with one another. In other words, they don't work together, they clash. So the more typefaces you add to a particular piece, the more chances you have of creating discord and confusion within the reader. By the same token, if you've got a lot of different elements, like Bringhurst was talking about, if you've got a textbook, think about your textbook that you have in any of your other classes. Not only do you have the actual text itself, the copy that you're reading, but sometimes you have images, or you have tables of data, or you've got illustrations, or you have chapter text, and you have headings and subheadings and footnotes and page numbers, and all of these things that make up the actual text itself. Well, how should those be laid out? Should we use the same typeface and the same size for all of it? Well, then it just kind of becomes homogenized and just a big mess. All those other little elements which may lend itself to the reader as far as information, like page numbers. Do you want the page number to get lost with the rest of the copy because it's the same size and the same typeface? Do you want the footnotes to just look like it's just additional text that flows after the last paragraph of a page because it's typeset with the same font and the same size? Or do you want to approach those particular elements as individual parts, but part of the whole piece? In other words, in the case of the footnotes, you should work to design those things so that they are separate but a part. So maybe in the case of the footnotes, the typeface that you use, if you're using a serif face in the actual text, maybe use a sans serif face and a smaller typeface for the footnotes so it stands out, so it is apart from the actual copy, but the reader recognizes that that piece of information is separate but part of the whole. And that's what you want to do. Now, there's a lot of things like this, and sometimes novels, we're talking about nonfiction novels, sometimes they don't need those kind of signposts like you have in textbooks, where you have headings and subheadings and footnotes and running headers and things along those lines. But they often do require markers of other kinds. For instance, if we were to look in this particular example, this is a novel called Far Tortuga. It was from 1975, and it uses 2 different sizes of type and 3 different kinds of margins, free-floating block paragraphs, and other typographic devices to separate thought, speech, and action. So if you take a look at this, you have the way that this particular text flows. If you'll notice, there's a kind of an organic feel up at the top. Sergeant Major, Butterfly Fish. These are thoughts that are going through a particular person's head. Then you have actions. The bottle fills. The yellow label shimmers. Then you have text that is set with a wider margin on the left side, an indentation. That shows speech. Black Honduran. How'd that go, Vernon? That's speech. So you can see, even though the same typeface and size and style per se are used in this particular text, the way that it's laid out actually allows the reader to understand what they're reading and what is going on. If the same thing was just all set where it's all flush left, that would be a little bit more difficult for the reader to understand. But in this case, the reader begins to understand exactly what's going on and can start to kind of immerse themselves into what the writer is saying, rather than expending a lot of energy trying to figure out, is this somebody speaking? Is this an action? Is this a thought? A little bit further, and this particular example is from Ken Casey's novel, Sometimes a Great Notion. And it flows like a conventional prose, but it shifts repeatedly in mid-sentence between Roman and italic to distinguish what the characters say from what they actually say in silence to themselves, what they're thinking. So if you look in this, if we go a little bit further down the page, it says, really coming down out there, isn't it, Teddy? There's more to this than. I suppose so, Mr. Drager. Teddy, look, even this little effeminate frog of a bartender, even he knows more than I do. Floyd Evanwright told me I could find Hank Stamper's wife here. You see how that worked? They have this wonderful text, and the conversation between these two characters are set in a way that makes it very distinct. It's very apparent that these people are talking to one another out loud, but when it flips to italics, that's the character thinking in their head. It's a very simple way of doing this, but it works really, really, really well in this particular case. Here's another example. In this particular case, this one is from Robert Mason's performance, typographic performance. I didn't misspeak there. This is a typographical performance, a printed performance on paper. And it's a performance of a specific play. And in this play, if you'll notice that each of the characters in the top left-hand picture, and I will post these pictures online for you to see them up close, but each individual character has its own typeface, its own typographic style, so that you know as you're reading the book who is saying what and to whom. And on top of which, as you get through this book, you have all these wonderful little illustrations. The text itself is twisted and stretched and combined and smushed together to kind of create a visual performance for the reader. It's very well done, even if you don't understand French. And finally, poets such as Apollinaire, for instance, the boundaries between the author and the designer begin to vanish in pieces like this, where the writing merges with the typography and the text, if you'll notice, becomes its own illustration. I'm sure each and every one of you recognize the Eiffel Tower, or a horse, or what appears to be a woman in a sundress and a giant hat. Even if you don't understand the language that this poem is written in, you immediately identify what the poem is written about. Very well done. Next tactic. You want to make the visible relationship between the text and other elements a reflection of the real relationship. So, in other words, if there are notes on the page, if there are for instance, to say footnotes. Where should they go? You need to think about this. Do they need to go at the bottom of each page? A lot of texts and a lot of very large books that have very many references. The Bible is a good example of this. You'll often find a lot of different Bibles with tons of footnotes at the bottom of every single page, and those footnotes are being referenced within the text above it. Well, if you've got hundreds and hundreds of pages of footnotes, typically placing those footnotes along in the same place as the text that's referencing them makes sense. If you don't have a lot of footnotes, maybe it's better to put those footnotes at the end of a chapter. Or, in a lot of academic writing, the footnotes are added as an addendum to the end of the overall work itself. It's its own section at the very end of the piece. So where should these kind of things go? As well as if you've got illustrations or photos, should those be embedded with the copy, or should they be their own special section? And if they are embedded in the copy, how should the text flow around those photos or illustrations? If the photos or illustrations have captions, how should those captions be set? How much white space should you give between the photo and the caption and the rest of the text? These are things that you have to think about. The relationship, the visual relationship, the proximity of all of these various elements and how they're laid out, the size, the typeface, all of these things are things that you as an artist need to think about. It's just the same as when, in photography class, when you are composing a picture in the viewfinder of your camera. How do those elements line up? Are you putting the subject directly in the center with everything else around it? Are you offsetting that subject? And how does everything frame the subject itself? You need to think about the visual relationship within the actual text. Next, you need to choose a typeface or a group of faces that are going to honor or elucidate the character of the text. Now, in this case, elucidate just means to make clear. So in other words, you need to make sure you choose a typeface that will make clear what the writer is trying to convey. For instance, if I'm laying out something, a great literary work, let's say something from Shakespeare, I probably don't want to set that in Comic Sans, because that certainly does not honor Shakespeare, nor does it make it clear what Shakespeare is actually writing. In fact, it gets in the way of what Shakespeare is actually writing. So you want to make sure you choose a proper typeface that will honor or elucidate, make clear the character of the text. Next, you want to shape the page and frame the text block so that it honors and reveals every element, every relationship between elements, and every logical nuance of the text. So, well, what does this mean? Well, think about this in this terms. How you actually frame the text with your margins, as an example, plays a big part into how the text is going to be received by the reader. If I were to make a metaphor in what this is trying to get at, think about this in terms of art. How would you like, or what would it look like if the Mona Lisa had a more modern, thin metal frame around it rather than the giant ornate wooden frame that it currently has sitting in the Louvre? Think about how crazy or how cheap that would make that art feel if it was in like a $10 frame from Michael's. Conversely, dogs playing poker, how crazy would it be to put a painting like that in a frame that's overly ornate, like a Baroque period frame with, or Renaissance style with gilded, gold leaf inlay? They don't match, right? They don't work together. It doesn't make any sense. You look at it and you're kind of thinking, well, one of these things is not like the other, right? They don't work in harmony with one another. Well, the same thing goes that the way that you shape or you frame the text on the page needs to be done in a way that honors the text. And we talked about this in a previous lecture on framing the text, specifically in terms of protecting the text against the thumbs, which are kind of like the text's biggest enemy. But not only that, you want to be able to frame the text so that you have a proper measure length, so that you have the right amount of space for things like footnotes and page numbers and and sign markers for things like running headers. And you want to also be able to do so that the text itself stands apart from those other elements. You don't want to have a margin so small that the text begins to encroach on the space for things like page numbers or running headers or footnotes. You want to make sure that the text is isolated and allows itself to kind of stand on its own so that it can breathe life into the work and into the reader. If you don't, things will start to get muddy. And finally, you want to give full typographic attention even to the smallest details. So when we talk about the smallest details, the incidental details, these are the things like page numbers. Don't just spend all your time crafting a beautiful layout for the text and make things like page numbers and running headers an afterthought. You want to think about what you're going to do as far as the typesetting of those incidental elements that make up the whole, because they're just as important. They need to be harmonious with the rest of the text. The layout needs to make sense. In other words, you don't want to spend all this time framing, laying out, setting up the various relationships between the elements on the page, and you don't want to have to spend all this time that you're working on going through the various logic of the text and the typography and setting apart things like italic styles and regular styles and bold styles and indents for block quotes and all that wonderful stuff, and then just basically mess everything up by putting page numbers in a place that page numbers shouldn't go. Or doing all of that and forgetting that you needed to leave space for things like footnotes. These little incidental elements of any text that you need to lay out are just as important as the text itself. So you need to make sure that you give it your full attention. It is a part of the whole. And even though these small little incidental details may seem like a small thing, they can essentially ruin an entire performance. If you think about it in the case of music, great musicians can take a song or take some lyrics that don't really say a whole lot and make people buy millions of albums. I mean, there's plenty of examples out there of artists that have songs that are just, the lyrics are inane and have the same thing repeated 20 different times, yet they sell millions of albums because, again, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And so in this case, these incidental details, it's not exactly what they say, but it's how you display them on the page that makes all the difference in the world. So, a little bit of a summary. For typesetting, your foremost job is to invite the reader into the text. You want to make sure that when somebody opens up a book that you've laid out, that it's inviting, that the typefaces are clean, are clear to read, and that the reader feels like, yes, I'm ready to start reading. The page is not just a giant block of text that you have ridiculously long measure links, that it is done in such a way that it's framed properly with the right size, with the right typeface, that it makes the reader say, or it tells the reader, welcome, sit down, kick back, and enjoy. That's what you want your text to say. You want to be able to reveal the tenor or the meaning of the text. So again, going back, reading the text, understanding what you're laying out, it's all really important because you got to understand, what is the meaning? What am I trying to convey? What is the reader trying to convey? And how can I, as an artist, help in a visual performance way bring that to the reader? You want to be able to clarify structure or order of the text. Going back to some of those examples where you have things like the author has characters' thoughts on the page as well as actions on the page. Well, how do we differentiate between an action and a thought and a spoken piece within the overall text? How do we clarify that? Or if we're doing something more mundane like a textbook, how do we clarify what is a caption, or what is a footnote, or what is a running header, or what is a page number as opposed to the text? How do we clarify this? Not only that, how do we clarify the structure between, say, images and the text that's describing that image? Or tables of data? How do we clarify that particular structure? You need to be able to link the text with other existing elements. Again, Not only are you clarifying structure, but how do these elements link together? How do we make sure that in our design that we ensure that the text itself, the copy itself, the copyright, the manuscript, how does that link with other elements on the page? In the case of footnotes, a lot of times you'll find superscript, little numbers or letters or characters that direct the user's attention to a section either at the bottom of the page or in the back of the chapter or the back of the book to explain exactly what that text is stating or a link to another source or a reference or a cross-reference. So how do we link this text with other existing elements? And finally, how do we induce a state of energetic repose, which is the ideal condition for reading? What exactly does that mean? Well, this is one of my favorite oxymorons in all of typesetting rules. An energetic repose. How do you be energetic yet restful at the same time? Well, when we typeset, we want to make sure that the type honors the text, that the type is formed and framed in a way that is welcoming to the actual reader, and we want to make sure that the typeface is done so in a way so that when the reader begins to delve into the text itself, that there aren't any of those speed bumps. There aren't any hurdles that they have to go over. They aren't expending additional mental resources to be able to figure out what it is that's going on. No, we want them to be restful. We want them to be in a state in which they are fully divested in the work of art. We want them to be into the text. And at the same time, we want that text to be able to leap off the page. We want it to grab their attention, to burrow itself into their soul. We want them to feel like they're part of the story. And we can do all of that as long as we pay attention to what we need to do as typographers. I'm sure many of you have probably written or read books in the past where as you're sitting down and you begin to read, the words of the page kind of fall away and you begin to imagine the scenes and the places and the characters and the actions and the things that are going on. And as you're turning page by page, you simply just totally lose yourself in the book as the story comes alive, as you begin to eagerly anticipate the next page turn, the next part of the story. What happens next? I've got to find out. And before you know it, you've spent 3 or 4 hours reading a book and you're just emotionally drained at that point, even though you haven't moved an inch since you started reading. Those are the books that not only have great material to work from, but also the typographers and the printers did their jobs to the best of their ability. And that's what we want to do. That's what we want to be as layout artists.